Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and this is Varietal Literature, a group of writers from Vancouver who have fun with narrative. What you've stumbled in here tonight is our Tuesday night show, which is Fireside Fairytales, because we are Fireside, and I'm going to read fairy and folktales. Specifically, I'm going to read Ukrainian folktales tonight, because I think that folktales and stories and so on are essential cultural threads. And well, I have a lot more to say on that, and indeed was writing an essay about it last week, which I don't know if I'll put out or not. But that is my way of saying I have a lot of ideas about it. Which I'm not going to belabor this show, because this show is about stories. So I'm going to say up front that we have a lot of stories to talk about, and they have a wonderful sense of humor and cleverness to them that is a lot more lively than some of the stuff we've looked at. I really, really enjoyed reading this book, genuinely. And I have spent most of the weekend reading most of it, which I will admit is not generally what I do with these collections. And it made it very hard for me to pick what I wanted to do, and I may even do a set of stories next week from this book as well. But there is something we need to do first, which is the book opens with an introduction to Ukrainian culture, history, and its folktales and its origins. And while I'm not going to read the whole thing, I am going to read part of it, because I think in order to sort of really grasp why these stories are important and why I think, especially right now, they are worth retelling, I think you got to know more about the place than I think the average person who watches this does. But if you're not watching this live, and that's not interesting to you, you couldn't care less, or you already know it, there will always be timestamps in the description below where you can jump ahead to the stories. And I think the first story is probably one of my favorites, so if you're looking for somewhere to start at the first one, see if you like it. However, if you are not watching it live, if you are watching it live, you're stuck with me reading this stuff for about 5 to 6 minutes. So apologies if history is not really what you logged in to hear about. That's fair enough. It's not usually what I talk about. But I'm going to read a bit of history from the introduction of this book. And the whole introduction is brilliant. The book is actually quite hard to find. I had a hell of a time finding it. It's called The Magic Egg and Other Tales from Ukraine. It's actually one of the newest collections we have, which puts it on the borderline about reading it. It's from the 90s. So I think it's worth remembering that this story would have taken place relatively short, or this collection would have been put together relatively shortly after the Ukraine was no longer even in part with the USSR. So it would have been a recent after the fall of the Iron Curtain. But here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read this history. If you don't want to hear that part, go down to the descriptions and skip ahead to the stories. I'm going to read you a couple of things. I'm not starting from the beginning of the history, but I will say that there is, according to this book and other sources I checked, credible evidence that Ukrainian culture has been consistent and persistent in the forms that it has today from at least 5000 BC. So it is a very old land of people. But I'm going to start us with the Cossacks, which is important for some of the stories we're going to read, which is why I'm starting in this piece of history. Cossacks came out of an uprising in 1648, so this is fairly far along in their history, and I'm just going to read from the text for a few pages here for 5 or 6 minutes, and then we will go into the stories. The Cossacks were a new class of Ukrainians who lived as independent frontiersmen, not unlike American cowboys. The word itself is related to a term meaning free person. Many Cossacks were serfs who had fled from their masters, but others were nobles and townspeople. By colonizing the wild southeastern plains of the country, the Cossacks acquired land and wealth. In establishing new communities and fighting the Tatar nomads from the east and the Turks to the south, they also developed courage and military skills. Although the Cossacks initially tolerated Polish domination, they eventually rebelled. Organized under the political and military leadership of elected rulers called hetmans, the Cossacks freed Ukraine from Poland and established an independent state based on democratic principles. So again, this is around 17th century. They abolished serfdom, built schools, and restored Eastern Orthodoxy as the religion of Ukraine. Cossacks also made raids against the Tatars and Turks, and they became well known as skilled and fearless warriors. There are many stories and legends about them, while generally depicted as honest and forthright heroes, occasionally, as in the story of Dovbush's treasure, which is a story we will read tonight. Cossacks are of mixed repute. Come on. Russian imperialism. This is still a part of the same thing. The Cossack era was relatively short-lived, and by the end of the 18th century, eastern Ukraine had been overtaken by expanding Russian Empire. Important here, because I know some people are not so good at history. This is not the USSR. This is Russia, prior to the USSR. Eastern Ukraine had been overtaken by the expanding Russian Empire. Peasants were again forced into serfdom, schools were closed, and speaking and writing the Ukrainian language was prohibited. All this was part of an effort called Russification, that is, making Ukraine subject to Russia. In the meantime, Austro-Hungary, under the Habsburg dynasty, forced its way into western Ukraine, and the Ottoman Empire of Turkey invaded the south. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Ukraine underwent a political and cultural revival. Secret societies conducted scholarly research of the history, language, and ethnography of Ukraine, and the arts began to flourish. Some of Ukraine's greatest literary figures, Taras Shevchenko, Ivan Franko, and Lesya Ukrainka, emerged during this vital and productive era. Unfortunately, the new feelings of Ukrainian nationalism only met with further repression and persecution from the Tsarist government, which was the Russian government at the time. Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution. Now this is USSR. After the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, the people of Ukraine established the Ukrainian National Republic. The Ukrainian parliament, named the Central Rada, was led by Ukraine's most highly respected historian, which I looked up the name and nobody told me how to pronounce, so I'm going to say Mikhailo, and I won't do violence to his last name. Later that year, in the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. Soon after, they invaded Ukraine for the next 3 years. Violence and terror reigned as Ukraine struggled for its independence. Meanwhile, Western Ukraine had declared itself a republic, only to be attacked by Poland. After 3 years of strife, the Ukrainian Republic collapsed, and in 1920, Soviet Ukraine was established. In 1922, the United the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, was formed under the leadership of Lenin, Trotsky, and the Communist Party. Ukraine, along with Armenia, Georgia, and Belarus, was absorbed into the Soviet regime. After a brief reprieve that followed the revolution, Stalin and the Soviets began a reign of terror in Ukraine and elsewhere, attacking the intelligentsia, artists, writers, poets, professors, and other educated people, persecuting, imprisoning, and killing Ukrainian nationalists and other dissidents, and seizing farms and factories. Oppression from the Romanians and Poles only added to Ukraine's distress. Soviet persecution culminated in the Great Famine of 1932 to 33, in which it was estimated that 3 to 6 million Ukrainians died of starvation. This famine was not the result of crop failure, but instead was caused by the policy of collectivization, which was a Soviet thing, instituted by Stalin and the Soviet government. Having been devastated and demoralized the Ukrainian population, the famine weakened resistance to Soviet rule. To this day, it remains not only a disastrous event in Ukrainian history, but one of the greatest tragedies in world history. Then, during World War II, Ukraine was invaded by Nazi Germany. And I gotta be honest, it goes on. I'm not gonna go on. I wanted to give you a snapshot of a land that twice established its own independence as a republic. Well, 3 times now. And every time, from all sides, somebody invaded. But important things to remember here is the Cossacks. The Cossacks, this first sort of independence from imperialist inquisitions and invasions on Ukraine, are where a lot of the origins of stories and stuff that we're going to read come from, because they are legendary figures. Like they said, not unlike American cowboys, but of course everything is unique, so it's not a perfect analogy. That's the end of the history. Except to say, and I'm paraphrasing from the author's introduction, but I don't want to take any more time from the actual reading of stories here, that one of the things that happened was that folklore at various points by those various occupiers and so on had a different status in Ukraine and a different way of being used. And one of them was as a way of proving that they were lesser than Russian society. So there was one view that they were sort of backwards. This is around the Tsarist regime. That they were kind of backwards and they had the wrong language and all those kind of crap that you usually hear in history. And so the collection of folklores and stuff was supposed to be a demonstration, a sort of showing of how low and this peasant literature that they had. So in that way it was collected, but in a kind of insulting way, which, by the way, is a thing that Nazis did as well. The other way it got used was Soviets initially banned it. Then they realized that it was fairly effective for getting information across to a population, and so they started to control it and change it so that it met with their ideas. And so what we're going to look at is a collection of stories that are collected from various places, including Russian folklore collections, because at around the turn of the century, a lot of folklore collected under the title of being Russian was actually Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian. And we've read some stuff from one of the famous collections of that, Russian Folktales or something is what it's called, which is a collection of many different places. So some of them are pulled from that. Others are pulled from people in the regions of Ukraine that the author had talked to. So you're going to get a lot of variety, but I think it's important to remember there are many, many different layers of occupation and problems that get reflected in these stories and how they've changed their telling. Okay, now, if I have anybody left who is still listening to this, because I know this is not the stories that I usually promise, we are going to start tonight with a lovely, clever story called The Gossip. Make my drink of water. This is the gossip from the Magic Egg and Other Tales of Ukraine. By the way, there are some anomalies in the text file here, in the EPUB file, because it was a very hard book to find, and the version I found is not flawless. So if you are the one to read along, that's why some of it's kind of broken up weird. The gossip. 2 brothers, honest and hard-working men, lived on the outskirts of a small village. They made a decent life for themselves by farming, hunting, and fishing. But the younger brother had a weakness. He was a gossip. Time and time again, the older brother would confide in him, only to find out later that the whole town knew the secret. Now, this troubled the older brother, but what could he do? After all, he only had one brother, and there was no one else in the world for him to turn to. One day, when the brothers went to check their traps in the forest, they found a small sack of gold coins. Happily, they exclaimed at their good fortune. But the older brother immediately began to worry. Now my brother will tell the whole village, and everyone will want to get their hands on our money, he thought, until he came up with a plan. Yes, he would teach his brother a lesson. So the older brother went to the river and caught a pike. Instead of bringing it home, he placed it in the garden among the peas. Then he took a hare from one of their traps in the forest and put it in one of his fish traps in the river. Later that day, when the 2 brothers went out to check their fish traps, the older brother said, "I've been hearing strange rumors lately." "Oh?" The younger brother immediately became interested. "Yes, they say the fish are now living on the land, and the forest animals have moved into the river. What do you think of that?" "Oh, what nonsense," scoffed the younger brother. The older brother agreed and said no more as they walked toward the river. When they pulled the fish trap from the river, though, there was the hare. The younger brother stood with his mouth agape for a moment and then said, "What if that rumor is true?" "Oh, it can't be," the older brother assured him, and the younger brother agreed. As they walked home, the older brother said, "Let's stop at the garden and get some peas for dinner." So they did, but as they were picking the peas, the younger brother suddenly cried out, "There's a pike in the peas!" Sure enough, the older brother came and marveled at the fish, then lifted the pike into their basket and said, "Well, perhaps those rumors are not so far-fetched after all." Amazed, the younger brother agreed again. After dinner, the 2 brothers went to their parents' grave. On the way, they saw 2 shadowy figures tussling at the side of the road. It was actually a bear killing and eating a cow, but because it was getting dark, the younger brother could make neither head nor tail of it. "What's that?" he asked. "Why, that's a dead man wrestling with the devil," replied the older brother. The younger brother shuddered and said, "Let's get out of here." So they turned and went home without visiting the graveside. A few days later, the 2 brothers went to the village. As soon as they arrived, the younger brother started grabbing people and blabbering. "We found a sack of gold coins at our traps in the forest." The crowd started gathering as the younger brother launched excitedly into his story. But the older brother looked at the younger as if he were crazy. "Have you lost your mind? When did such a thing ever happen to us?" "Why, just the other day," exclaimed the younger brother. "The same day we found the hare in the river and the pike in the pea patch." But the older brother just looked more puzzled. "You remember," the younger brother went on, "it was the same day we tried to go to our parents' grave, but we ran into the devil wrestling with a dead man and we had to turn back." The villagers began to snicker, and the older brother took his younger brother by the arm, saying, "I think perhaps we should leave now. It sounds like you're getting tired." The younger brother protested vigorously. "No, it's true," he insisted, but the townspeople were no longer interested. They shuffled away, chuckling and shaking their heads. So the 2 brothers went home, and from then on, no one ever believed the younger brother's stories. Eventually, he just stopped telling them, and that is how the older brother taught his younger brother not to gossip. And that's The Gossip, our first story from the Magic Egg and Other Tales from the Ukraine. Okay, which means we're going to go on to our next story. Because I sort of belabored you with so much non-narrative stuff at the beginning, I will sort of roll as smoothly as I can into the next story. So the next story is called Dovbush's Treasure. This is a reference to a real figure. I will give you some background on it that I gathered from this book, which is a footnote you will see, but also from my my own separate research that I did on it. And it relates to Cossacks, which is this story is one of the reasons why I wanted to read you the context of that history. Dovbush's Treasure. Things were not going well for Evis. After a bad harvest, now his youngest son lay lying in bed sick with fever. Winter was approaching, and as the days shortened, the poor peasant wondered how his family would survive. Perhaps, he thought, he could gather a little wood to sell in the village. So Evis ventured into the forest, his head filled with worries, with his eyes fixed on the ground. He scrambled about, picking up small scraps of wood. Hours passed, but he still only had a small pile. Farther and farther he wandered. Finally, it started getting dark, and Evis looked around and realized he didn't know where he was. He was lost. What could he do? He kept walking in hopes that he would find a familiar spot, but he recognized nothing. By then it was almost too dark to see anything, so when the poor man spied a cave, he crawled in, covered himself with leaves, and went to sleep. Outside the cave, the owls "ooh, ooh" hooted, and the wolves "howl" howled, and the darkness seeped over the earth. Evis, dreaming strange dreams, slept fitfully. When he awoke, it was light. Evis looked around and saw that the cave was full of barrels. Brushing the leaves from his clothes, he crept over to one of the barrels, timidly lifted the lid, and peered inside. Gold coins and jewelry? He went to another and looked. Silver! Yet another was filled with precious gems. With his heart pounding, Evis ran from barrel to barrel, finding more and more treasures. Suddenly he stopped in his tracks. He looked around. Wasn't anyone here to guard the treasure? He had a strange feeling that he was being watched, but he saw no one. Evis called. No one answered. He called again, but still no answer. He began scurrying from barrel to barrel, stuffing as much loot into his pockets as he could. When his pockets were full, Evis jammed some into his boot and still more into his shirt. As he did, he kept looking nervously over his shoulder, but he saw nothing. Then, just as he was about to leave, he heard a voice. "Tot it back." Evis spun around. There stood the most horrible-looking man Evis had ever seen. His long, tangled hair and beard were filled with twigs and bits of leaves. His sunken eyes flamed wildly. His clothes, which had obviously been very fine once, were now ragged and covered with moss. Evis stood there with his mouth open. "Put it back, I said," thundered the old man. Who are you?" stammered Evis. He was shaking so hard that the coins in his pocket jingled. "I am Alexis Dovbush, and this is my treasure," was the answer, and the old man went on, bellowing like a bull. "I shed innocent blood for this treasure, and now there is a curse on me and my riches. The earth will not accept my body, and God will not accept my soul. I cannot die." Still shaking, Evis stood rooted to the ground and his eyes wide. "Take only what you need, and put the rest back," Dovbush continued, "or you too will suffer eternal damnation." Yes, of course. Evis smiled weakly as he emptied first his pockets, then his shirt, and lastly his boots. When he finished, he picked up 2 gold pieces and put the rest back in the barrels. "Now go," shouted the old man, pointing his gnarled finger towards the cave entrance.
Follow the stream until you come to a large rock. Then climb the hill, and you'll be at the road to the village.
Okay, so before I follow the rest of the story, Alexa Dovbush was a Cossack, and he comes up in other tales, but he is considered a Robin Hood figure. He was largely seen, he was rich, but he was a leader of a band of outlaws who was sort of known for robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. But as the story demonstrates, there is the view that he killed a lot of people that probably didn't deserve it to do those thieving routes, whether he did good things with it or not. So he is largely a hero, a kind of Robin Hood for Ukrainian folklore. And that's all I'll say, because we got more to do. But he's a real guy. Sorry, Robin Hood, not really a real guy, but Alexa Dovbush is a real guy. Evis wasted no time leaving. He followed Dovbush's instructions and found himself at the road to the village. As he walked, he kept thinking about what had happened and wondering if it was really true. Again and again, Evis thrust his hand in his pocket and rubbed 2 coins together to reassure himself. When he finally arrived home, Evis's wife thought he had perished in the night and threw her arms about his neck and sobbed with joy. It was not long after this day that Evis and his family began to prosper. The peasants used his gold pieces wisely. First he bought medicine for his son, then he bought grain for the planting season. He planted grain and tended his crop carefully and reaped a good harvest. Evis had enough to feed his family and a little left over to sell. With his profits he bought more grain, and in the next season he again made a profit. Then he repaired his house and bought farm animals. First he bought a goat, the next year a cow, the next a horse, and then another horse. In the meantime, Evis's wife expanded the garden. She grew more and more vegetables. She planted fruit trees. She bought hens and sold the eggs. The children, too, grew healthy and strong. Even the youngest, who had always been sickly, stopped catching cold after cold. But all this prosperity did not go unnoticed. The neighbors began to talk. First a little, then more. Some whispered about sorcery and buried treasures. Others said Evis was a thief. Some even thought Evis's wife was up to something. Then one day, Evis made the mistake of going to the tavern with some of the other villagers. He made an even bigger mistake by drinking too much Horilka, which is vodka or just grain liquor. The men began to question and tease him. "What's your secret?" demanded Ihor, the blacksmith, pounding his big, hairy hand on the table. "Yes, tell us," the others chimed in. "How did you get so rich? Are you a magician, or did you steal it?" wheedled Demetrio, another peasant farmer like Evis. At first, Evis denied everything and said he had earned his money by hard work and careful planning, but the villagers kept pestering him. All right, I'll tell you," said Evis, giving in at last. He recounted the whole story of how he'd gotten lost in the woods and stumbled upon Dovbush's treasure. That only made the teasing worse, though. "You really think you saw old Dovbush?" laughed the tailor they called Danilo. "Why, he's been dead for 100 years. You don't believe in ghosts now, do you?" "I can't believe you left behind all that treasure," Ihor said incredulously. "You must be crazy." "Yes," taunted Demetrio. No wonder you were always the poorest man in the village. You're too stupid to take advantage of opportunity." "And he never went back to check." Ihor shook his head sadly, and everyone roared with laughter. When Evis left the tavern, the men were still talking, and their laughter rang in his ears. He tried to go back to work, but the words kept gnawing at him. What if he was a fool, as they all said? Was he really so stupid? Evis lay awake all night, tossing and turning, thoughts churning through his mind. Perhaps Dovbush had not been a man at all, but just a moss-covered stump. Maybe he'd been so tired and frightened in the woods that he had dreamt Dovbush. Why not go back just to see? The children were getting older. They needed things. His wife deserved nicer things, too. Evis was tired of scrimping and saving. Surely a barrel of gold would solve all his problems. By morning, Evis knew exactly what to do. He set out for the forest, retracing his steps, walking along the same road on which he had returned years ago. When he reached the hill, he climbed down. There was the rock and the stream. Evis followed the stream to the cave's entrance and crawled inside. His heart was pounding so hard that his ears rang, but as his ears grew accustomed to the light, he saw the barrels. Barrels and barrels and barrels. Evis ran to one and excitedly wrenched off the lid, only to recoil in horror. The barrel was full of writhing vipers and snakes. Gasping, he stumbled to another barrel and opened it. Bats flew out. Underneath them, rats squirming and squeaking noisily. Staggered to a third barrel, bumped into it, and tipped it over. Out poured fleas and ticks and other blood-sucking vermin. They scattered in all directions. Then the wind howled. Take only what you need. And that is the end of that story. That is Dovbush's Treasure. And that is a water break for me. GS says, I noticed the first story didn't use magic. Yeah. I think it's worth pointing out that folktales and fairy tales are not necessarily magical and spiritual. They tend to be stories that are told and retold. I think that's probably the simplest way to put it. Stories that don't tend to have single authors and that different regions feel compelled and like they have a right, because they do, to retelling in their own ways. That said, the stories that people like to read are ones that involve magic and ghosts and spirits and so on. Hello, Horace. It's wonderful to see you in here. Aren't you supposed to be sleeping? I like the part where there were humans. Okay, so Dovbush's Treasure and The Gossiper, the two stories we've read so far. I really like the next one. It's another one that doesn't really have magic to it. But it's such an original tale. This is called The Old Father Went to School. And I think it was really interesting that the author or the editor, or however you want to look at it, the person who compiled this, which is part author, editor, but also is shared with the people she collects the stories from, says that there is a sort of respect and reticence for the elderly in Ukrainian folklore. And that one of her theories as to what informs that is that older people were, by and large, the people who held stories and retold them. I'm sure it goes deeper than that, but I thought that was an interesting observation. But this is definitely a story I believe came from an older storyteller. Okay, this is called The Old Father Who Went to School, from the book The Magic Egg and Other Tales from Ukraine. Once there was a man whose wife died and left him with 3 children to raise, 2 boys and a girl. The man lived many years, his children grew, and eventually they married and moved into separate homes to start families of their own. The time came when the man could no longer care for himself. The old fellow thought to himself, I will spend my remaining days with my children. He packed his bag and went to live with the oldest son and his family. The family met him at the door with smiles and open arms. At first, they treated him with respect. His shirts were always mended. The wife made sure he had plenty of food at the dinner table. She even cut his meat for him. But after a time, the bliss wore thin, and the son and his family became resentful. The wife forgot to mend the father's shirts, and the children poked fun at their old grandpa. Even his own son was cruel. Sometimes he would glower angrily or fly into a rage over what seemed to be a minor detail. "You sound like a hog. Can't you eat without snorting?" Then the children would snicker and the wife would tighten her lips, but no one would say anything in the old man's defense. Disheartened, the father thought to himself, Oh dear, the picture froze. One moment. Let's see if we can get that back up. And never can tell what informs that. There we go. Okay. Should be okay now. Thank you for letting me know, GS. Disheartened, the father thought to himself, "I am a burden to my son and his family. Perhaps I should stay with my second son." He packed his belongings and went to live with the second son and daughter-in-law. At first they were happy to see him. There was no end to their graciousness, but the old man soon realized that he had only traded wheat for straw. Every bit of food he took was met with angry glares from around the table. Then one night the old man overheard the son and his wife talking. "Things were hard enough before your father came, and now we have to take care of a helpless old man on top of everything else?" The wife chided. Much to the old man's dismay, his son agreed, adding, "But what can we do with the old fool?" "There's nothing for me but to go live with my daughter," thought the father. And so in the middle of the night, he packed his bag and left without even saying goodbye. But things were no different at his daughter's. Everyone was kind at first, and they called him Didis, if I'm remembering the pronunciation correct. Let me know in the chat if you know that I'm doing that wrong. Which is a grandpa in Ukrainian. But first soured quickly. "Must you eat so much?" the daughter scolded. And the son-in-law rolled his eyes at every word the old man uttered, as if to say, "What an old fool." The old man realized that none of his children wanted him, and he had nowhere to go. What could he do? Then one day the children got together for a meeting to decide what to do with their father. As they sat around the table arguing, their voices grew louder and louder, so it was that their father, who sat in the next room, heard every word they said. "But we have 4 little children to feed," said the eldest son's wife. "Our home is so small, we have no room for an extra person," said the second son. "You know we have no money," said the daughter. "We can't afford to care for him." And so it went on into the night. Tears rolled from the old man's eyes as he listened to his children discuss his fate. When he finally fell asleep, they were still arguing. The next morning at breakfast, everyone seemed quite pleased, and they told their father that they had a wonderful plan for him. "Oh?" The old man brightened, his bleary eyes widened a little. "Yes, father, we've decided to send you to school." "To school? But I'm old. I'm almost blind. How can I go to school at my age?" he protested. But the children insisted. "Oh, father, don't be so difficult. You'll have your own desk to sit at, and we'll take turns packing your lunch. You'll be fine." The old man hung his head, but kept silent. What else could he do? He did not want to go to school, but he didn't want to stay where he wasn't wanted either. Finally he agreed, and he set off for the school, which was in a neighboring village. Stunned by what had become of his life, the old man stumbled down the road. He turned things over and over in his mind, but he just could not make sense of it. After walking for some time, he saw a nobleman approaching. "Hello there, good fellow," the nobleman greeted him. "Hello to you too, kind sir," he replied. "What takes you down this road?" the nobleman asked as he dismounted from his horse. The old man motioned to the noble to come closer and, opening his lunch bag, offered some food. "Oh, well, I am going to school in the next village," he shrugged. "What? To school? Why, at your age, you should be taking it easy and enjoying life. Why go to school?" So the old man poured out the whole story, and as he did, the tears again began to stream down his cheeks. There now, said the nobleman, putting an arm around the old man's shoulder. Don't fret. School is not the place for you, but I have something here that might help. He took out a silk purse, the kind that only a nobleman would have, and took something from his saddlebag to fill it. Then he put the bag into a carved wooden box and handed it to the old man. Oof, it was heavy. The man shook the box and listened to the jingle and smiled. Now here's what you do, began the nobleman. They ate bread and cheese together as the nobleman laid out his plan for the old father. When the old man returned home, his children saw him coming. At first they were upset, but then they saw the box. What do you suppose the old duffer has there? Said one. Who knows? That box looks heavy, though. Look how he's carrying it, said another. Still another added, perhaps it's money or jewels. At that they all ran out to meet their father. Didas, Didas, they cried. Oh, they acted all so happy to see him as they hugged and kissed him and patted his back. Then their gazes all fell to the box. You're wondering about the box, the old man began. Well, the strangest thing just happened. Oh, I see. Didos. Yes, that's right. You saying it now, I remember. I do look up all pronunciations. Whether I remember them is another story. If you wanted quality, you wouldn't be here. You're wondering about the box, the old man began. Well, the strangest thing just happened. You see, when I was a young lad, before I married, I knocked about the whole world a bit and made a little money. I didn't want to spend it all, so I buried this box beneath an oak tree down the road. I guess I just forgot about it then, but I happened to pass by the old oak on my way to school, and I thought to myself, aha, I wonder if my little box of goodies is still under the tree. I dug, and sure enough, here it is. He held up the box for his children to see, and they all smiled and clapped their hands in anticipation. Let's have a look inside, said the eldest son, but the father shook his head. Oh, you'll get it all right, but only after I die, and the one who gets it will be the one who treats me best. He turned and walked into the eldest son's house as the family stood with their mouths gaping. Then they all rushed after him, begging him to stay at their own house, or at least have dinner with them. And did he have any shirts that needed mending? Oh yes, now there was no end to their kindness. So it went. For the rest of his days, the old man was treated like a king, but he never let the box out of his sight. When he finally died, the children had an elaborate funeral for him, each trying to outdo the next with flowers, prayers, and tears. The funeral lasted for days, but when it ended, the children began to quarrel with one another. Each thought he or she alone deserved the box. They talked and talked, but they could not agree, so they asked the townsfolk to vote. The whole village gathered together, and each of the children made their case. Well, after all the speeches and hours of deliberation, the villagers decided that the children had all been equally good to their father and that they should divide the contents of the box evenly amongst themselves. The eldest son ran to fetch the box. He returned holding the box high, beaming from ear to ear. He set the box carefully in front of his siblings, and the second son carefully opened the lid, and the daughter lifted out the beautiful silk purse and gingerly shook it. Jingle, jingle, jingle. A sigh went through the crowd. Then the daughter slowly poured the contents onto the table. But what did they see? Glass, glass, and more glass. The brothers and sisters glanced nervously at each other and began desperately rummaging through the pile. Finally, the eldest son exclaimed, "Why, our father left us nothing but glass!" It was then that the villagers began to snicker. One after another, they put their hands to their mouth as the laughter bubbled out. A little girl piped up, "You see what happens when you send your father to school?" An old man said, "I'd say he learned his lesson well. Now perhaps you'll learn yours." And that's the end. GS says, ha ha ha, I love this delightful yet accurate story. Yeah, it's a pretty charming story, honestly. I really enjoyed it. Again, though, no real magic to it. I know that is the association that people have to folk and fairy tales. So where are we at with time? Oh, we're doing pretty good for time. Okay, so with that in mind, we are going to read The Clever Maid. If you typically watch this series that I do, you know that I tend to put my favorites last, and this is no exception. This is called The Clever Maid. In the grand tradition of folktales, it takes a turn. So if you've not heard a lot of folk and fairy and traditional sort of peasant stories, which is mainly what we read, they don't really follow like 3-act structures or things like that very closely, and they're not too concerned about that. It's about what's interesting. And so what happens is you get these sort of first acts that feel very disconnected from later acts. And I think this is one of those ones. So if you think you know where it's going, you kind of don't. So it's worth it to stick it through to the end, because it's at no point did I really predict where it was going to go next. And I think it's very clever. I think a good story. Okay, this is The Clever Maid from the Magic Egg and Other Tales from Ukraine. Once there was a poor peasant who had nothing to his name, but he did have a daughter, and her name was Natalka. Through the years, they managed to scrape by, but as the man grew older, he wanted to provide for his daughter so that she would have something when he was gone. He went to his landlord and asked if there was something he could work towards. Perhaps a horse or a cow. "Why, yes," said the landlord. "I'll give you a cow. If you work for me for a year, you can keep it." He showed the peasant a rather sickly, thin cow. Didn't seem like a very good deal, but the peasant had no other choice, so he accepted the offer. The peasant took the cow and went to work for his landlord. Day in and day out, he slaved in the fields, never allowing himself even a short break. In the meantime, Natalka cared for the cow, and the cow became healthy and fat. When harvest time came, the peasant worked even harder and longer hours. In fact, he worked so hard that just before his year was up, he became ill. He missed 3 days of work and then reported back to the landlord to make up for the time he'd missed. "I'm sorry," said the landlord, "but you broke your promise. I want the cow back." "Sir, I am willing to make up the time," the peasant protested, but the landlord would have none of it. "A promise is a promise," he said. "The cow is mine." The two men argued for hours, but they could not reach an agreement. Finally, the landlord suggested that they take the matter before the king, who was said to be a wise man. The peasant was tired of arguing, so he agreed. Now the king, as wise as he was, did not want to listen to this argument. When the two men began explaining the situation, he put up his hand and said, "Before you go any further, let me ask you 3 questions. Think about them and bring your answers to me tomorrow. Whoever has the right answers can keep the cow." The two men looked at each other and shrugged. "The first question, what best fills a man's stomach? The next, what gives a man most pleasure? And finally, what travels fastest? Now go and think on it. Tomorrow you'll bring me your answers." So the two men departed. As they walked, the landlord started jabbering. "I can't believe he asked such simple questions. Everyone knows it is meat that best fills a man's stomach, and money that gives the most pleasure, and as for what travels fastest, why, what else could it be but hunting dogs? Those are my answers, and they are right. I know the cow will be mine." The poor man said nothing, for he was deep in thought. The landlord was right, but surely the king was not looking for such obvious answers. He thought and thought. Still, he could not come up with anything, and by the time he reached home, he was confused and disheartened. He walked into the house and sank into his chair and sighed. "What's troubling you, father?" his daughter asked, for she could see he was distraught. The peasant explained what had happened and complained that he could not think of the right answers to the king's questions. Natalka smiled. "That's easy, father. What best fills a man's stomach is our Mother Earth, for Earth feeds us throughout our lives. And it must be sleep that gives the most pleasure. Why else would we leave everything for it? What travels fastest? I say it is thought. Thought takes us anywhere in no time at all." The girl's father chuckled. "You're right, Natalka. I will tell this to the king." The next day the landlord and the peasant went to the king. "Have you the answers, then?" the king asked. Yes, yes, the landlord blurted out impatiently. "It's meat that best fills a man's stomach, the gold gives the most pleasure, and hunting dogs that can travel the fastest. Now, can I take the cow?" "Wait just a moment," the king replied, and he turned to the peasant. "What have you to say?" "I say Mother Earth best fills a man's stomach, for she nourishes him throughout his life. And it is sleep that gives most pleasure, for we give up everything for it." The king stroked his chin pensively. "And what about the third question?" "Nothing travels faster than thought," the peasant replied. "It can travel anywhere in no time at all." "Well said," the king exclaimed. "The cow belongs to you. You are indeed a clever man." The landlord stomped off in a huff, while the peasant stood there beaming. "Actually, it was my daughter who came up with the answers," said the peasant, shrugging. "What? A young girl who pretends to be as wise as royalty?" The king scowled with displeasure. He handed the peasant a basket of boiled eggs. "You give these eggs to your daughter. She must put them under her hens to hatch. When the chicks are grown, the girl will roast 3 for me. I'll have them for breakfast tomorrow. You will go to prison." The peasant stood with his mouth open, stuttering with dismay. But how can she?" he protested weakly. "That's enough," boomed the king. "Come back tomorrow morning with the roasted chickens." The poor man was really discouraged now. He left in a quandary. Why had he agreed to let the king decide his fate? It only made things worse. Maybe he should have let the landlord keep the cow? At least then he wouldn't be faced with prison. So he thought as he walked home with the eggs. By the time he reached home, the peasant's eyes were filled with tears. His daughter met him at the door. "What's wrong, father? Did my answers displease the king?" "Oh, Natalka, now we have a real problem," the old man replied. Then he recounted what had happened, adding, "I'm supposed to bring him 3 roasted chickens tomorrow morning. What can I do?" But his daughter just laughed. "That rascal," she said, handing her father a pot of porridge. "Take this porridge to the king. Tell him we need millet to feed the chicks when they hatch. He should prepare his field and plant the porridge. As soon as the millet is ripe, he must reap it, thresh it, and send it to me so I can feed the baby chicks." So the father did as his daughter had instructed, but the king was not amused. He took one look at the porridge and threw it to his dogs. Then he took a stalk of flax and handed it to Natalka's father. "Tell your daughter to soak and dry and dress this flax, then spin it into 100 yards of cloth. If it's not done, I'll put you both in prison for the rest of your life." The peasant shambled home, crying. When Natalka saw him coming down the road with his head hanging, she ran to meet him. Father, what is it now?" Her father handed her the stalk of flax. "The king says you're to make 100 yards of cloth from this, or we'll both go to prison. What shall we do?" The old man buried his face in his hands. Natalka shook her head as her father spoke. Then she went out to the apple tree in the yard, broke a tiny twig from it, and handed it to her father. "You tell the king that if he wants cloth, I must have a spinning wheel. You can fashion it from this, then I will spin the flax. So the peasant trudged back to the castle and spoke again to the king. He told the king what his daughter had said and handed him the little twig. The king threw the twig to the floor angrily. This girl is a tough one, he thought to himself. Then he said aloud, Go tell your daughter to come here. She must neither walk nor ride, be neither barefoot nor wear shoes, and come neither with a gift nor without one. And if she cannot do as I requested, you will both be hanged. Hanged? Now the king was threatening him with death? The peasant returned home sadder than ever. He told his daughter of the king's new demands and threw his arms into the air. We're doomed, he lamented. But Natalka comforted him, saying, No, father, I'll go to the king and everything will be fine. But first you must catch me a live rabbit. So his father went to catch a rabbit while his daughter prepared for a trip. She harnessed a goat to a sled, caught a sparrow, and put a shoe on one foot but not the other. When her father brought the rabbit, she put it under her arm. Then she placed one foot on the sled, with the sparrow in hand and the rabbit under her arm, and she left for the castle. The king was waiting for her. As the girl approached, he saw that she had once again outwitted him, so he sent the dogs after her. Natalka saw the dogs coming, though, and released the rabbit. Immediately, the dogs started chasing the rabbit. Then the peasant's daughter entered the castle. I brought this for you, she said, and as she held the sparrow out to the king. The bird flew from her hand and out the window. Just then 2 men arrived to have the king settle their dispute. It seems that they spent the night in a field, and during the night one of their mares had foaled, given birth. Both wanted to claim the colt as their own. They presented their case to the king, who said, Tie the mares to 2 different trees. The foal will go to its rightful mother. So the men tied their horses to 2 trees, and then both began calling to the colt. The poor colt became terribly confused and ran off. Everyone stood staring, not knowing what to do next, until Natalka spoke up. Oh, there's our spam. I was thinking, like, we haven't had spam in a while. Pardon me. We'll see what Natalka says in a moment. Priority 1 is to get rid of spam. It's taking its time. Okay, I'll come back to that. So, Natalka spoke up. You would have better luck if you did it the other way around, she said. What do you mean? Snapped the king. If you tie the foal to the tree, its rightful mother will go for it, she explained. The men did as she suggested, and as soon as the horses were free, one ran straight to the colt. The king saw that the girl was wiser than he was, and he shook his head. You are truly a clever woman, he sighed. Go home now, go to your father, and live in peace. So the peasant's daughter returned home, and her father was overjoyed to see her. And from then on, they had no problems with the landlord or the king. In fact, whenever the king needed advice on a difficult problem, whom did he send for? The clever maid, Natalka. GS says this daughter's a genius. Yeah, I think that's the point. She is beating them all. Alright. Let's get rid of this person who's giving us spam. We're pretty much exactly at an hour. I have some other things I could read, but I think that's probably enough. I sort of read you, I guess I would call it clever tales, like things about people being smart and clever and scheming and whatever else. I think I always reserve the right to change things because the weeks you never know how they're going to go. But I think next week, I'm going to tell you 3 stories from here that connect to the Swedish lore about foxes. And I think it's really interesting that it is very similar to Swedish tales. But it's not just Swedish tales. Actually, the clever fox thing comes up in a lot of tales. I just haven't read it before. And this book has 3 tales, some of which might be very familiar to people who've watched this, from the clever fox trope, as like a consistent character. I think I might do that next week. And I might also next week give you the founder myth of how the earth was made and how evil came into the world, to sort of mythological things. Because Ukraine, like a lot of places in Europe, was initially a pagan society, and there's still elements of that paganism in these stories, but in 9th century became, essentially Christian, and has been pretty much Christian the whole time since, in various iterations of it, though. With a few exceptions. GS says very entertaining. Yeah, I really like these stories. I mean, that's why I spent most of the weekend reading it. It was really hard to pick stuff. There was a Christmas story in here called The Christmas Spiders that was killer, but obviously, I missed it for the Christmas season. For those of you who came around and listened, thank you very much. I guess what I would say is a couple of things before I sign off. The first thing is there is an idea that has gotten a lot of purchase, in my opinion, in society. And that is that narratives and stories are just idle entertainment. And while they certainly can serve that role, all art is political. I realize that's unpopular these days to say. I think to some extent people don't quite understand what political means, and that might be where their opposition to it comes from. But all art is political. And folktales and the retelling of these stories and so on is no less of a political act. And it never was anything else to me. One of the things that comes with war is the destruction of everything beautiful about the people you war with. Going way back to even, burning of libraries and stuff during Roman wars and whatever else. The things and beautiful pieces that have been lost, and the stories that you lose when you suppress and murder people is tragic on top of a tragedy. It's the layers of the tragedy. So I'm really glad that this collection exists. I certainly hope that there will always be people connected to these stories to tell them. I myself am not Ukrainian, obviously. But at the very least, I think there is something essential and rebellious in holding on to your stories when people want to tell you you're someone else. With that said, take care of each other out there, and try and get some sleep. And, God, I won't make it too heavy in the end. Obviously, the whole point is to be able to escape from some things in the world with this, but honestly, no more war, man. No more war. I will see you Thursday at 6:30 for a more energetic and comedic writing of stories live called The Varietal Show. I've been Rory. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Varietal_lit. If you haven't liked and subscribed, I'd appreciate it, but you don't have to. If you really like this, the best thing you can do is share it around. And if you want to read stories from me, you can go to varietal-literature.ca. There's stories from me and lots of people, original stories. Thank you very much. Peace.